She was erased from the family, mocked as a forgotten ex-wife. But when the will was read, jaws dropped. He left everything to the woman he once betrayed. What followed was a storm of secrets, heartbreak, powerful journey of redemption that no one saw coming. Can forgiveness truly heal 15 years of lies? Stay until the end. You won't believe how it ends. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful true stories. They thought I came to beg. That's what their eyes said when I walked into that glass palace of marble and entitlement, like a stray dog had wandered into the country club. I heard the sharp click of my heels echo across the lobby, a beat too slow, a bit too uncertain. The receptionist barely looked up before asking my name. "Eleanor Hammond," I said softly. "I'm here for the will reading." She blinked, recognition flickering behind her mascaraed lashes. Then she nodded, her voice suddenly tighter, more professional. 14th floor, conference room. They're already there." Of course they were. I wasn't early. I was exactly on time. That was my first act of defiance. I would not sit quietly in a corner for 1 second longer than I had to. I stepped into the elevator alone, clutching my worn leather purse like it was armor. Inside, a single manila envelope pressed against my ribs. I could feel its weight more than anything else. It had waited with me for weeks. Now, it would speak. 15 years. That's how long it had been since Jonathan divorced me. 15 years since I watched him trade in a marriage for a 25-year-old with a law degree and legs up to her throat. 15 years since I watched him shape our children into cold, brittle versions of himself. Versions that didn't include me. 15 years of silence, of watching from the periphery while he built an empire with a woman who looked at me like I was a stain on the family crest. The elevator doors slid open on the 14th floor with a soft ding. My heart pounded once, twice, then steadied. I saw them through the glass wall of the conference room, even before I stepped in. Cassandra Hammond, legs crossed in a sharp black sheath dress that likely cost more than my rent, chatting animatedly with one of Jonathan's lawyers like she'd already been crowned queen. Her golden hair gleamed under the recessed lighting, perfectly waved and motionless. Bryce sat to her right. Tall, handsome, and as cold as a courtroom floor. He looked so much like his father it hurt. Same set jaw, same calculating stare. Lila was beside him, all angles and polish, scrolling through her phone with a scowl of boredom. She didn't look up, but I saw her fingers twitch when she noticed me through the glass. My hand froze on the door handle. I could have left right then, walked away. Let them have it. The money, the titles, the company, the smug certainty that I'd disappeared forever. But I had one thing they didn't. The truth. I pushed the door open and walked in. The room quieted instantly. You'd think I was a ghost. Not a single soul greeted me. I made my way to a chair in the back, far from the lawn-polished table where the inner circle sat. No one offered me a seat at that table, and I didn't ask. I didn't need their scraps. Bryce broke the silence first. "Why is she even here?" He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the lawyer, like I was a scheduling mistake. "Jonathan divorced her 15 years ago." The words sliced me open, but I didn't flinch. I'd grown calluses in places they couldn't see. Cassandra smirked and tilted her head, her voice deliberately loud. Maybe she's hoping for a keepsake, a photo album, something sentimental. She was playing to the room, and she got the laughs she wanted. Her friends, a trio of surgically smoothed socialites, chuckled, eyes flicking to my outdated coat and shoes. I sat down, folded my hands over my purse, the envelope pressed against my ribs, still there, still waiting. One of Jonathan's longtime business partners, Robert Dunn, walked past me with a glance so dismissive it nearly burned. "I thought the cleaning staff wasn't allowed during legal meetings," he muttered. More laughter. My stomach turned, but I smiled faintly. If they needed to laugh to feel powerful, let them. I'd come armed with something much stronger than pride. Cassandra turned and addressed me directly for the first time, still lounging like a cat in the sun. "Ellie, is it? You still go by that? You look well. I hardly recognized you without the apron. What are you doing these days? Arts and crafts for retirees." I nodded politely. "Still painting, still teaching, the usual." "The usual," she repeated, tasting the words. How quaint. Lila finally looked up from her phone. Her eyes, once soft and round as a child, now glinted with the same chill as her father's. She didn't say anything, just lifted the phone again and casually angled it toward me. I heard a whisper. "Mom's here." Still clinging to the clearance rack. She added an eye roll for dramatic flair. I didn't react. I'd practiced not reacting for 15 years. Bryce stood and walked toward me, slow and deliberate. He didn't smile. He didn't greet me. He leaned down just enough that only I could hear. "This isn't your family anymore. I don't know why Hartwell invited you, but you should leave." His eyes were Jonathan's, but darker somehow. Meaner. "I have every right to be here," I said. "Mr. Hartwell asked for me personally." He straightened, jaw tight. "You stopped being part of this family a long time ago. We all did." I stared up at him. "I never left you, Bryce. You chose to believe I did." He blinked once, just once, and then turned away. I heard Cassandra whisper something to Robert, something cruel, something meant to sting, but I didn't catch it. I was looking at Lila, who for one strange second was looking back. Really looking. Like she remembered something. Her 8th birthday. Her glittery Mother's Day card. Her tearful breakdown in my arms when that boy broke her heart at 16. Then Bryce said something to her, low and sharp, and her gaze shifted again, back to armor, back to ice. A young assistant entered then, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Hartwell will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats." No seat had been placed for me at the table. Of course not. I wasn't meant to be seen. "You may remain there, Miss Hammond," the assistant said quietly, as if to spare me the embarrassment. I nodded. "Thank you." They sat like royalty around the table, Cassandra at the end, Bryce and Lila flanking her. Robert and the other associates filled the remaining spots. I sat alone, but I wasn't afraid. They were waiting for a fortune. I was waiting for the truth. The side door opened. Harrison Hartwell entered. Crisp suit, silver hair, and a face like a steel vault. He nodded once to the room. "Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Today we read the final will and testament of Jonathan Hammond. May he rest in peace." He glanced toward me. Not a long look, but deliberate. They thought I came to beg, but when the will was read, they'd remember exactly who I was. I could feel the weight of their stares, even as they pretended I wasn't there. Cassandra tapped her manicured fingers on the mahogany table, making a soft, rhythmic click that somehow echoed louder than it should. Bryce stared at the water pitcher like it had insulted him, and Lila, ever the performer, resumed scrolling on her phone like she hadn't just filmed her mother for laughs. But I didn't shrink. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping them steady. My purse sat beside me, and inside it, that manila envelope pulsed like a heartbeat. They didn't know it yet, but it held more power than anything in this room. I had debated whether to bring it at all, whether I should play the game as silently as I had for the past decade and a half, or if today, finally, I'd let the truth speak. It wasn't vanity that brought me here. It wasn't greed either. Jonathan had called me 6 weeks before he passed. At first I didn't recognize the number. I'd considered letting it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. His voice was thin, like paper over flame. He asked if we could meet. He didn't beg, he didn't apologize, not then, just asked for coffee. That was Jonathan's way. Always asking without explaining, always expecting the world to rearrange itself around his will. And for some reason I said yes. The next time we met, he looked smaller, worn, but he was quieter too, quieter than I'd ever seen him. There was a tremble in his hands and a truth in his eyes I'd never seen before. And over a series of coffee shop meetings, sometimes once a week, sometimes every few days, he told me everything. About the regrets, about the lies, about how he twisted our story to make it easier for the children to blame me instead of him. How he told them I had checked out emotionally long before the divorce. How he showed them pieces of therapy bills, emails taken out of context. All just enough to let them believe it had been my coldness, my detachment that drove him away. And not, of course, the fact that he'd already been sleeping with Cassandra when Lila was still in middle school. I never fought back. Not in public. Not in court. Not even when people whispered that I had abandoned my kids or ruined my marriage. I kept my dignity like a coat pulled tight in winter. I told myself the children would understand one day. But years passed and understanding never came. Just distance. Just silence. Jonathan confessed it all over black coffee and lemon muffins, and somewhere in the middle of it, maybe in the 3rd or 4th meeting, I stopped hating him. It was strange. I'd spent so long building walls around that pain that when he finally said, "I'm sorry, Ellie," I was a coward. The words didn't sting. They dissolved something in me. Not because I needed him back, not because I needed closure, but because for the first time in 15 years, someone finally said out loud what I'd carried alone. That I wasn't the villain. That manila envelope in my purse. Jonathan gave it to me himself. He said, "They won't believe me, not unless they see it in black and white." It was his proof. Phone logs, emails, even screenshots of messages he'd sent to Bryce and Lila, trying to arrange meetings with them before he passed. All ignored. All left unanswered. "I want you to have this," he'd told me, "in case they accuse you of manipulating me, in case Cassandra tries to contest the will. You'll need it." I hadn't wanted it, but I took it. Now, watching them in that room, Cassandra adjusting her lipstick in a compact mirror, Bryce whispering something to Robert, Lila pretending I didn't exist, I felt the heat of it all over again. That envelope wasn't just proof, it was a reckoning. The door opened and Harrison Hartwell entered, quiet and composed. His voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "We are here to read the final will and testament of Jonathan Hammond." Cassandra leaned back in her chair, one leg elegantly crossed over the other, a flicker of a smile on her lips. She looked like a woman who'd already been told exactly what she was getting. I could almost see the script running behind her eyes. Inheritance, ownership, legacy. She thought she'd won. I wondered if she even knew what Jonathan had done, if he had told her anything before he passed, or if she was about to find out like everyone else in real time. Hartwell cleared his throat and continued. "Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge this is a difficult time. Mr. Hammond updated his will 6 months ago under full legal capacity, witnessed and notarized. These were his final wishes, expressed without coercion." Cassandra stiffened. Only slightly, but I saw it. 6 months ago was after the diagnosis. After he started seeing me again, Hartwell looked down at the pages in front of him and began reading the will. The formalities first, the legal verbiage. My name hadn't come up yet, but I could feel it building, like a storm just beyond the horizon. At the table, Cassandra tilted her head, and I saw the corner of her mouth twitch. Lila whispered something to Bryce, and he gave a faint, humorless laugh. They weren't just dismissing me. They were sure, absolutely certain, that I was nothing more than a footnote. A relic of Jonathan's past, irrelevant to the empire he'd built with Cassandra. They thought the story had already been told. But they were wrong. I watched the way Hartwell's eyes scanned the room before he read the next line. The way he paused, just for a heartbeat. "To my first wife, Eleanor Hammond," he said, and the room froze. Cassandra's smile vanished. Bryce looked like someone had punched him in the chest. Lila stopped scrolling. The silence in the room thickened, turned sharp. You could feel everyone inhaling at once. I leave my entire estate, and that's when the gasp started. They thought I came to beg, but they were about to learn. I came to collect. There was a beat of silence after the lawyer spoke, just a flicker of time, but it felt like the ground itself had tilted. "To my first wife, Eleanor Hammond." Harrison Hartwell repeated, voice calm, steady, cutting through the still air like a bell tolling in a cathedral. "I leave my entire estate." It hit them like a tidal wave. Cassandra's mouth parted soundlessly, the color draining from her face so fast I thought she might faint. Bryce stiffened, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the table. Lila stared, eyes wide, mouth slightly ajar, as if the words hadn't yet computed. I sat perfectly still. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I folded my hands in my lap and looked straight ahead, not at them. Not yet. The lawyer went on, unfazed by the gasps, the strangled cough from Robert Dunn, the low murmur of disbelief spreading like wildfire across the room. "To Eleanor Hammond, I bequeath the entirety of my personal and corporate estate, including but not limited to Hammond Innovations, all shares and assets therein, my real estate holdings, including the primary residence on Willowcrest Lane, all investment portfolios, vehicles, artwork, and personal property, to be transferred in full immediately upon my death." The room broke. Cassandra stood up so fast her chair skidded back with a screech. "That's not possible," she choked, her voice higher than usual, laced with something feral. That has to be a mistake. I'm his wife." His wife. Hartwell didn't even look up from the document. There is no mistake. The will was revised and witnessed under proper legal procedures. Mr. Hammond was of sound mind and body. The estate is to be transferred as stated. She turned to Bryce. Say something. This is insane. But Bryce looked like he was underwater, like someone had cut the power to his brain, and all he could do was sit and blink. He turned to Hartwell. What about us? What did my father leave to us? Hartwell flipped a page, adjusted his glasses. To my son, Bryce Hammond, he said, his tone unwavering, I leave the sum of $50,000. This includes forgiveness of all outstanding personal debts owed to me, which total approximately $175,000. Bryce jolted like he'd been slapped. What? He snapped. That's not even a tenth of what he said the business was going to be mine. To my daughter, Lila Hammond, Hartwell continued without pause, I leave the sum of $50,000. This includes the forgiveness of personal debts totaling $122,000. Lila's hands dropped to her lap, her phone forgotten. She was pale as porcelain, and for the first time in years I saw something unfamiliar flicker in her expression. Bewilderment, maybe even guilt. Cassandra grabbed the back of her chair for support. This is fraud, she hissed. It's manipulation, and now she pointed directly at me. She tricked him. She got to him while he was sick. I want this will contested. I want it thrown out. Hartwell finally looked up, his expression measured and precise. Mrs. Hammond, and oh how stiffly he said that title. If you choose to contest the will, you are within your rights. However, I must inform you that Mr. Hammond included a no-contest clause. Should any beneficiary legally challenge the validity of this document and fail, they will forfeit all bequeathed items and compensation. Cassandra's mouth snapped shut, a no-contest clause. Jonathan had anticipated this. I could feel her panic vibrating through the room. She'd gambled on charm, on image, on longevity, and she'd lost to the woman she'd tried to erase. I don't accept this, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. 10 years. I stood by him for 10 years. He was mine. He loved me. But even as she said it, her voice broke. Hartwell turned to another envelope. There is more, he said. Mr. Hammond left a letter, handwritten in the final weeks of his life. He requested it be read aloud today. My heart twisted at the sight of it. I'd never seen the letter itself, though Jonathan told me he was writing one. He said he needed to say some things that would be easier to hear if they came from the grave. He wanted his children to know the truth. Hartwell unfolded the pages slowly, reverently, and began to read. To my family, the letter began. If you're hearing this, I am gone. I hope I left this world with a measure of peace, though I know I leave behind unrest. I imagine many of you are surprised, confused, even angry by what I've done in this will, and you are entitled to those feelings. I've made mistakes, grave ones, but I need to explain why I chose what I chose. The room was so silent I could hear Cassandra's breathing, fast and shallow. Ellie, was my wife for 20 years, Hartwell continued, voice steady but thick. She gave me her youth, her brilliance, her patience. She raised our children with love and strength while I built my empire and pursued success. And when I betrayed her, when I let my ego and ambition lead me into another woman's arms, she did not retaliate. She did not destroy me in court. She walked away with dignity and grace, and I let my pride convince me I was right to leave her. Hartwell glanced at me just for a second. I didn't blink. I kept breathing. To preserve my own ego, I told our children she had grown cold. I presented carefully curated evidence, therapy receipts, one-sided emails, conversations taken out of context. I let Bryce and Lila believe she had abandoned us emotionally. It was a lie. I fed it, and I watched it eat away at their relationship with their mother, and I did nothing to stop it. Ellie never fought back. She never tried to poison them against me. She let them have their version of the story, even as it broke her. Bryce had gone pale. His hands trembled in his lap. Lila stared down at the floor, lips pressed tight, eyes glassy. I came to understand in the final months of my life what a colossal failure that was, not just as a husband, but as a father. I reached out to Ellie, hoping for closure. Instead, she gave me kindness, forgiveness. She saw the broken man I'd become and offered me a place to lay down my guilt. In those moments, she reminded me of the man I used to be, before ambition devoured him. Cassandra scoffed loudly. Touching. I'm sure she helped him write it. Hartwell didn't pause. He read louder. To my current wife, Cassandra, I know you will be angry, and you have the right. But we both know this marriage was not built on love. It was a bargain. You got the lifestyle. I got the admiration. I didn't begrudge you for it, but I also came to see that your presence widened the chasm between me and my children, that your values, status, wealth, image shaped theirs, and it broke my heart. Cassandra's face contorted, eyes blazing. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. To Bryce and Lila, the letter went on. I failed you. I gave you a warped picture of your mother, and I failed to teach you what matters most: truth, compassion, humility. The money I leave you is not a punishment, it is a doorway. Build your own future. Earn your pride. Rebuild your bond with your mother, if you can. She has never stopped loving you. The last line hit like thunder. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. I give my estate to Eleanor Hammond, not out of sentiment or guilt, but because she is the most deserving. Because she helped me build the foundation of this legacy, and because she will do the right thing with it, in a way I never fully did. This is my attempt to set things right. Hartwell's voice dropped lower as he read the final sentence. This is my repentance, my reckoning, my last act of truth. When he folded the letter, there wasn't a sound in the room. No one moved. The air hung heavy with everything that had been said, with everything that had been shattered. They thought I came to beg. But now they knew. This wasn't mercy. It was justice. For a moment after the letter ended, the silence in the room didn't feel like shock. It felt like judgment. Tangible. Searing. Like the walls themselves were embarrassed for everyone sitting at that long, gleaming table. Cassandra was still frozen halfway out of her chair, her lips parted in disbelief, but her body too stunned to move. Her mascara-framed eyes darted around as if searching for something, an ally, a lifeline, or maybe a rewind button on reality. She found none. Bryce's face was unreadable, but his jaw had locked so tightly it looked painful. The folder in front of him, once held with confidence, now rested untouched. His father's words had lodged somewhere deep inside, and though he didn't say anything, I could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. Lila, on the other hand, had bowed her head slightly. Her arms were folded across her chest, not in defiance, but like a child trying to shield herself from the rain. I sat in my corner, just as still as before. I hadn't moved since the reading began. I hadn't spoken a single word. But now every person in that room was looking at me like they were seeing me for the first time. Hartwell folded the letter with quiet precision and slipped it back into the envelope. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. Jonathan had already said everything. And now the room was suffocating in the truth he'd left behind. Cassandra was the first to speak. "This is ridiculous," she said through clenched teeth. "You people actually believe this?" He was dying. Delusional. Probably drugged. You've all heard what happens in the end. People lose grip, start romanticizing the past, rewriting history. Her voice was sharp, brittle. She reached for control and found only air. Hartwell's response was measured and firm. Mr. Hammond was evaluated by 2 independent physicians shortly before he amended the will. Both confirmed he was of sound mind and capable of legal decision-making. Cassandra turned on him. "So that's it? You're all just going to sit there and act like this is justice?" That she, her hand flung in my direction like she was pointing at a stain. She gets everything, after 15 years of absence, after she abandoned her own kids. I finally looked up, met her eyes, not with anger, not with smugness, just the quiet, unblinking weight of truth. "I never abandoned my children," I said calmly, my voice low but clear. "I was pushed out, erased." Bryce shifted. Lila raised her eyes and looked at me, really looked, and I saw something flicker behind the veil. Recognition, maybe. Regret. I stood slowly, placing my hands on the back of the chair to steady myself. Not because I was weak, but because I wanted to be deliberate. My words had been trapped behind silence for so long, I wanted to make sure they came out steady. Not like fire, but like stone. I didn't fight your father in court because I didn't want to drag either of you through that kind of war. I thought time would soften things. That one day you'd come find me and we could talk about it like adults. I glanced at them both. But that day never came. "You could have fought harder," Bryce said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You just disappeared." "No," I said. "I was always there. You just stopped seeing me." I turned slightly to face the rest of the room. "I sat at the back of your graduation, Bryce, behind the row where your father's lawyers told me not to sit. I saw you shake the dean's hand. I cried in my car because I couldn't hug you. I came to your dance recital, Lila, the one where you wore blue tulle and twirled like you owned the stage. I sat behind a pillar so you wouldn't see me and get upset. I mailed birthday cards. I called on holidays. I waited." Lila swallowed hard. Her lip trembled. Cassandra gave a dry laugh. "Oh, please. This is performance. If you cared so much, you'd have fought. You would have demanded joint custody, equal time. You wouldn't have left." I turned back to her. "I didn't leave. Your husband lied, to protect his own ego, and you were happy to let him." Hartwell cleared his throat gently. "If I may," he said, standing, "there's another item Mr. Hammond left in Miss Hammond's possession. May I?" I nodded, reached into my purse, the manila envelope. I placed it gently on the table and slid it toward him. Jonathan wanted them to see this. He knew they wouldn't believe words alone. Hartwell opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of documents. "These are verified communications, emails, texts, and call logs. Mr. Hammond's attempts to reach out to Bryce and Lila after his diagnosis. Some of these messages directly reference his desire to reconcile with their mother and tell them the truth about the divorce." He passed a page to Bryce. 6 missed calls in 1 week, Hartwell noted. Bryce stared at the printout like it was written in another language. "I thought those were about the expansion in Tokyo," he mumbled. Lila leaned forward and picked up a second page. Her fingers trembled. "He texted me to have dinner, to talk about family truths," she whispered. "I told him I was in Cabo. I never wrote back." The silence that followed was thick with realization. Cassandra stood motionless, her hands clenched, her lips a flat, bitter line. "There's more," I said gently. I pulled a small digital recorder from my bag. "He asked me to play this if it came to this point." I pressed play. Jonathan's voice filled the room. Weaker than I remembered, rasping at the edges, but still undeniably his. A ghost, not from the grave, but from the man he'd once been and had finally tried to become again. "Bryce, Lila," his voice cracked, but his words were clear. "If you're hearing this, I didn't get to tell you in person. I tried. God knows I tried. I'm so sorry. I lied to you about your mother. She never stopped loving you, never turned her back on you. I made her into the villain so I wouldn't have to look like one. I was wrong." Lila broke. Her shoulders shook, a soft sob escaping her lips as she pressed a hand over her mouth. Bryce didn't move, but his eyes were wet. Jonathan's voice continued. "She forgave me, even when I didn't deserve it. She's the only reason I found any peace in the end, and I trust her more than I trust myself. That's why I left everything to her." The recording ended, and with it, the last illusion shattered. There was no more room for lies, no more spin. Just the raw, hard truth. Cassandra sat down slowly, like her knees had given out. She looked at no one, not even herself. Bryce placed the papers down quietly, gently, as if they might break. Lila reached for a tissue, but she didn't look away from me. I met her gaze, and saw in it the first flicker of something I hadn't dared hope for. Maybe not forgiveness, but curiosity. The door to healing, I knew, never swung wide. It cracked open, slowly, quietly, and you had to be ready to walk through, even with trembling steps. For the first time in 15 years, I thought we just might be. The conference room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in under the weight of everything that had been said. I remained standing, though every part of me wanted to sit. My knees ached, my hands trembled just slightly, but I held my posture with the kind of stillness that comes only from years of practice, holding your ground when everything inside you wants to run. I looked at my children, grown now, but in this moment, they looked lost. Bryce had sunk back into his chair, shoulders hunched, eyes staring blankly at the polished surface of the table. His expensive watch caught the light, a gift from Jonathan on his 25th birthday. He used to show it off like a badge of honor. Now he seemed embarrassed to wear it. Lila sat frozen beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, mascara streaking lightly down her cheek. She hadn't wiped her tears. She wasn't trying to pretend anymore. I stepped toward them slowly. Every footfall echoed against the marble tile. "I know this is a lot to take in," I said quietly. "It was a lot for me too when your father reached out. I didn't expect it, I didn't trust it, but I listened, and the more he spoke, The more I saw the man I married again, even if only in glimpses. Lila raised her head, her lips parted. She looked like she was about to speak, but the words didn't come. I gave her time. I waited. Cassandra broke the silence instead. "Oh, don't let her fool you," she snapped. Her voice had found new venom, laced with bitterness that now had nowhere left to hide. "You're all falling for her little act. The wronged woman, the long-suffering ex-wife, just waiting in the wings for her hero to return. It's pathetic." Bryce's head turned toward her sharply. For the first time that day, there was something hard in his voice. "Stop it, Cassandra." She blinked at him. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." He pushed back his chair and stood up. "I don't know what's true anymore. I don't even know what to believe. But I do know this. Dad lied, and you," he pointed, not with malice but with clarity, "you knew. Or you didn't care to know. Either way, don't stand there and insult the only person in this room who seems willing to tell the truth." She looked stunned, as if the betrayal had suddenly flipped directions. "I stayed with your father when he was dying," she whispered. "I took care of him." "You had an affair with his business partner," Bryce shot back. Her mouth opened, then closed again. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let the silence settle. Let it do the work for me. Lila finally stood. Her voice was softer. "Mom, why didn't you tell us the truth sooner? About the affairs, the therapy, the things he said that weren't true." I took a deep breath. That question had lived in me for years. "Because it wouldn't have helped," I said honestly. "Not then. You were children. Hurt children, being told a story that made me the villain. If I'd tried to tear that story apart, it would have felt like I was tearing him down. And no matter what he did to me, I didn't want you to lose him too." "But we lost you," Lila whispered, "for so long." My voice cracked. "I know, and I carry that every day." She took a step toward me. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Her eyes met mine again, and I saw the little girl she used to be, wide-eyed, full of questions, torn between loyalty and longing. "I'm sorry," she said, barely audible. I reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "So am I." Behind us, Cassandra made a strangled sound and turned away. She grabbed her designer purse and marched toward the door. Her heels clicked like gunshots against the tile. "This isn't over," she snapped, not even looking back. "You can all play house if you want, but I'll see you in court." No one responded. The door slammed behind her, and the room exhaled. Hartwell cleared his throat politely. "If you'd like, we can move to another room for privacy. The rest of the legal matters can wait." I nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. That would be appreciated." He gestured to his assistant, who began quietly gathering papers. The rest of the business associates, who had been sitting through the emotional demolition in stunned silence, took the cue to leave. One or two glanced at me with something like respect. Others just looked relieved to escape. When the door closed behind them, it was just the three of us, me, Bryce, and Lila. My family. For the first time in 15 years. I walked slowly back to the table and sat down across from them. My fingers played absently with the edge of my purse, as if grounding me in something tangible. "I'm not expecting forgiveness overnight," I said. "I know too much time has passed for that. And I don't blame either of you for believing the version of events your father gave you. He was charming, convincing, and I let him shape the story because I thought it would spare you pain." Bryce rubbed his temple. "It didn't." I nodded. "No, I suppose it didn't." He looked up. "Why now? Why come back?" "Because your father asked me to. And because," I looked between them, letting the truth settle in my voice, "because I never stopped being your mother. Not for one day." Lila started crying again, quietly this time, and Bryce looked down, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to loosen a knot that had been there for far too long. I reached into my purse again, pulled out a small leather notebook. "Your father and I talked about what comes next. He wanted this transition to be peaceful, to be healing. I wrote down some ideas, options, not demands, just starting points." I slid it across the table to them. "He wanted you both to be involved in the company, if that's something you want, and I agree." Bryce looked startled. "You'd let us help run Hammond Innovations?" I gave a small smile. "Help run it? I'm hoping you'll take the reins, together. I don't want to be a CEO. I want to keep teaching art and hosting painting retreats. But this company, it's part of your legacy too. You should have a voice in what happens to it." Lila blinked. After everything we said to you, did to you. Forgiveness doesn't come from being deserving, I said gently. It comes from choosing peace over pain. The room grew quiet again, but it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It was lighter now, expectant, like a new page waiting to be written. Bryce picked up the notebook and opened it. His fingers traced the pages as if the ink held more than plans, as if it held a bridge between then and now. I don't know if I can forgive myself, he said softly. I leaned forward. Then let me forgive you first. He didn't look at me, but he didn't look away either. That was enough for now. Lila reached out, her fingers grazing mine, tentative but real. Can we talk more? About you and Dad, about what he was really like at the end? I squeezed her hand. I'd love that. There would be more tears, more difficult conversations, more moments when the wounds of the past would throb without warning. But this was the first healing breath. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that we might find our way back to each other. One honest word at a time. That afternoon, after the reading and the storm of emotions had settled into a raw, reflective quiet, Lila asked if we could go for coffee. It surprised me. Not the invitation, but how naturally it came from her lips, as if we hadn't spent 15 years estranged, as if just hours before she hadn't filmed me like a stranger in her world. She even said it gently, "Mom, there's a little place down the block. I think we could both use something warm." I said yes, not because I needed the coffee, but because I needed the moment. And I think she did too. The cafe was quiet, tucked between a florist and a bookstore. The air smelled of cinnamon and espresso, and the walls were lined with mismatched art prints. It reminded me of a place we used to visit when she was little, on Sunday afternoons after church. Back then, she'd order lavender tea with too much honey and declare it fancy garden juice. I used to laugh every time she said it. Now, as she sat across from me with a lavender latte in hand, her fingers curled tight around the ceramic mug, I wondered if she remembered too. "It's strange," she said after a long sip. "This place smells like my childhood, but I feel like I don't even know you." "You used to know me," I said softly, "when you were small." She nodded. "I know, I remember things, but they feel like stories I made up, like dreams. I spent so many years hearing one version of you, telling myself you didn't care. And now, everything's upside down." "That's okay," I said. "It's allowed to be confusing." She looked up at me. Her eyes were rimmed in red, but they were clear too, no longer guarded. "Did you forgive him?" she asked. "Dad, after everything?" I didn't answer right away. I watched a couple near the window laugh over something on a shared phone screen. They looked so light, so unburdened. I wondered if they knew what a gift that was, to carry no invisible weight between them. "I didn't forgive him all at once," I said. "At first, when he reached out, I was cautious, angry even. Not on the surface. I'd long since stopped screaming. But there was this residue, this ache that never really left. When he asked to meet, I said yes out of curiosity. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear what he had to say." Lila leaned in, her chin resting in her hand. "And then?" "And then," I smiled faintly, "he apologized. Not like the movies, not with flowers or declarations. Just simply, quietly, over black coffee and a lemon muffin. He looked me in the eye and said, 'Ellie, I was a coward.'" She blinked, her mouth trembling. "He never said things like that to us." "I know," I said, "but he meant it. I saw it. The sickness stripped him down, took the layers off. In those last months, he was more himself than he'd been in years. Or maybe just closer to the man he wanted to be before it all got complicated." Lila took a long sip from her cup, staring into the swirling foam like it held the past. "Did you love him again?" That question made my chest tighten. "No," I answered gently. "Not in the same way, not romantically, but I loved the peace we found, the mutual respect. We talked about art, about the kids, about regrets and what-ifs. It was a different kind of love, softer, quieter, not based on passion or promises, but on shared history and a willingness to be honest at last." She nodded slowly. "I wish I'd known that version of him." "He wanted you to," I said. "That's why he tried calling. That's why he left the recordings. He was trying to make it right, even if he was late." "I was in Cabo," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He texted me to talk about the family, and I told him I was too busy with friends. I thought he was just being dramatic." "You didn't know," I said. "None of us knew how little time there was." She stared out the window for a moment, wiping at her eyes. Bryce is struggling. I could tell. He's angry, but not at you. At himself, I think. At Dad. At everything. He'll need time, I said. He's always carried things in silence, even as a boy. Lila gave a small smile. He was so protective of me. Like Dad, he thought he had to pick a side. And so did you, I said. It wasn't your fault. You were told a version of events that made sense to your hearts at the time. She took a shaky breath. Thank you for not giving up on us. I wanted to, I admitted. There were days I didn't think I'd ever hear from either of you again. But even then, I kept your birthday cards in a drawer. All the ones you made when you were little. The glitter ones. The ones that said, "To the best mom in the universe." Her hand covered her mouth and she laughed through her tears. I remember those. I used to glue seashells on the envelopes. You hated how they wouldn't fit in the mailbox. They broke 3 of my mail slots, I smiled, but I kept every single one. She reached across the table then, and her hand found mine. It wasn't a full embrace, not yet, but it was warm and solid. Real. Do you think we can start over? She asked. I don't want to start over, I said. I want to start from here, with all of it. The truth, the damage, the possibility. I want us to rebuild, brick by honest brick. She nodded. Then let's do it. We left the cafe slowly, arm in arm. The sun had dipped a little lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, but the air was gentle, light. As we turned the corner back toward the office, Lila hesitated. Would you take a photo with me? She asked. Not for social media? Not yet. Just for me. I nodded. She took out her phone and we stood together, our heads close. She snapped the picture. Then looked at it and smiled softly. It's the first photo I've taken with you since I was 15, she said. My eyes stung. It's a good one. We didn't talk much on the walk back. We didn't need to. The silence was no longer hollow. It was full of something. Possibility, maybe. Or healing. When we reached the building, Bryce was waiting just outside, leaning against one of the marble columns. He looked up and straightened when he saw us. You guys were gone a while, he said. His voice wasn't accusatory, just unsure. We needed to talk, Lila said. You okay? He looked at her, then at me. His jaw worked for a moment, as if chewing over words he didn't know how to speak. I'm trying, he said finally. I don't know how to feel, but I'm trying. That's enough, I said. For now, that's more than enough. He nodded. Lila looked at me and smiled. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me begin to settle. We weren't a family again. Not yet. But we were finally facing each other. And for the first time since the divorce, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to being whole. The next few weeks moved slowly, like fog lifting off a lake at dawn. Gentle, uncertain, but steady. After the dust of the will reading settled, my world became a strange mix of solitude and sudden motion. Lawyers needed my signature on a mountain of documents. Bank representatives scheduled meetings in plush offices where I was offered coffee in china cups and asked how I wanted to structure my assets. I had never held this kind of power before. Financial power, legal power, and yet it didn't feel like mine. Not fully. Not yet. What I really wanted, more than the money, more than the real estate or the controlling shares of Hammond Innovations, was time with my children. Real time. No cameras, no lawyers, no courtroom energy clinging to the air like static. Just dinner, conversation, maybe laughter. And surprisingly, it started to happen. Bryce didn't come rushing back, but he didn't disappear either. He called once, then again. Each time his voice was hesitant, but there was something in it I hadn't heard in years. Humility. He asked if I would look over some ideas he had for the company. Strategic directions, potential hires. He wanted my input. I knew it was his way of reaching out, offering a bridge without having to talk about feelings. And I accepted. We met in the corner booth of an old Italian restaurant where the red leather seats cracked when you leaned back too far. He brought a binder full of spreadsheets and risk assessments. I brought a notebook with Jonathan's scribbled margin notes, plans he'd started drafting before he passed. For a moment, we were just two people trying to build something new out of something old. We didn't talk about the past, not at first, but when the waiter brought the check, Bryce cleared his throat. Did you know? He asked, not meeting my eyes. That he was sick, I mean. Before anyone else? I nodded. He told me about a week after the diagnosis. Why you? He asked. though the question sounded more like it was aimed at himself. I thought carefully before answering, because he needed someone who would be honest with him, who would tell him the truth without dressing it up, and I think because he felt safe with me, even after everything. Bryce looked down at his hands. I didn't even ask what stage it was. When he told us, I shut down. You were scared, I said gently, and hurt. He shook his head. No, I was proud. Too proud to admit that I didn't really know my own father anymore, that I hadn't asked him anything real in years. I just assumed he'd always be there. We walked out in silence, the cold air biting at our skin. As we reached his car, he paused and said, "Thanks for showing up, even after everything." I squeezed his arm lightly. "You're my son, Bryce. That's never changed." He didn't say anything, but he didn't pull away. Lila, meanwhile, had begun coming over in the evenings. At first, it was just to help with documents. She had a sharp mind for organization and a natural flair for digital strategy. But soon, she stayed for dinner, then for coffee, then for long talks about everything and nothing. One night, as we sat in my new apartment, she picked up a photograph from the bookshelf. It was an old one, her and Bryce, maybe ages 6 and 8, sitting on Jonathan's shoulders at a beach in Cape Cod. Their cheeks sunburned, their eyes sparkling. "I don't remember this day," she said. "I do," I replied. "You had just learned to swim without floaties. Bryce was jealous, so he kept jumping in next to you, trying to make bigger splashes." She laughed. "He's always been like that." Her face sobered a little. "It's weird, the more I'm with you, the more the memories start to come back. Real ones, not the ones Dad shaped for us." "I'm glad," I said. "I've been carrying those memories alone for too long." She set the photo down and looked at me, brows knit. "What are you going to do now? With the company? The money?" "I've been thinking about that," I said. "And I don't want to hold it all tight. That kind of power, it's too much for one person." I walked over to the dining table where I'd laid out some paperwork. "Jonathan and I talked before he passed," I continued. "He wanted the company to reflect a new kind of leadership, one rooted in transparency, responsibility. I want to honor that, and I want to include you and your brother, if you're willing." Her eyes widened. "You'd trust us after everything?" I smiled. "Trust is a choice, and I'm choosing it." She crossed the room and hugged me tightly, no hesitation this time. "Then I'm in." And just like that, something shifted. Not all at once, not like magic, but like a new foundation settling beneath our feet. Later that week, I arranged a meeting with both Bryce and Lila. We sat around the kitchen island in my apartment, the sunlight pouring through the windows, casting a golden warmth across the counter. "I have a proposal," I told them. "We create a family trust, not just to manage the estate, but to fund charitable programs. Education initiatives, single-parent support networks, cancer research. We take what Dad left us and turn it into something that lasts." Bryce leaned back. "A foundation?" "Yes," I said. "The Jonathan Hammond Foundation for Second Chances." Lila smiled. "That sounds right." We began drafting the structure that very day, assigning roles, brainstorming mission statements. For the first time, our conversations weren't about division or inheritance or betrayal. They were about impact, vision, healing. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Bryce stood and stretched. "You know," he said, "Dad used to say, Hammonds don't quit, we just pivot." I chuckled. "He said that during every crisis, even the burnt Thanksgiving turkey." Bryce laughed. "I forgot about that," Lila grinned. "He tried to deep fry it on the patio. We almost set the tree on fire." And just like that, we were laughing, real laughter, the kind that draws out old joy like a thread from a worn-out sweater. As we cleared the dishes and packed up our notes, I realized something had changed in the air. The resentment, the guarded tension, it hadn't vanished completely. But it had softened. What remained was real, earnest, willing. When they left, I stood at the window, watching them walk toward Bryce's car, talking quietly. No yelling, no walls, just siblings, rediscovering each other. And I thought of Jonathan. He'd gotten a lot wrong. But in those final months, he tried, truly tried, to make it right. And in this moment, I felt he had. Not because of the money, not because of the mansion or the boardroom seats, but because I had my children again. And we were finally learning how to be a family, not the one we once were, but the one we still had time to become. 1 month later, I found myself standing in a place I never expected to call my own. a light-filled art studio on the second floor of a quiet building overlooking a small park. The windows were tall and wide, inviting in the morning sun like an old friend. The floors were oak, worn smooth with time, and the walls were lined with easels, jars of brushes, and shelves stacked with watercolor palettes and charcoal sticks. I had always dreamed of a space like this. I just never thought I'd have it at 62. I had begun teaching again. Not to make ends meet, not out of necessity, but out of joy. My students were women like me, in their 50s, 60s, some older, women starting over after a divorce, the death of a partner, or just years of being invisible. We painted still lifes and seascapes. We talked, we laughed, sometimes we cried. Art gave us a safe space to be messy, to explore the parts of ourselves we'd pushed aside for other people's dreams. That morning, I was painting a new piece, an abstract horizon where shades of blue gave way to soft gold. I didn't realize how symbolic it was until later, a sky clearing after a storm. The door creaked open, and I turned. "Morning, Mom," Lila said, holding 2 cups of coffee. I brought the good stuff. She wore jeans and an oversized cardigan, her hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. "You're up early," I smiled, setting down my brush. "I had a board meeting prep call at 7, she said, handing me my cup. "But I figured I'd stop by before heading back to the office." "The foundation office?" I asked, even though I already knew. She grinned. "Where else? We just signed the lease yesterday. It's small but cozy. I found this mid-century sofa that looks like it came out of a Wes Anderson film." "You always did have a thing for vintage charm," I said. She leaned against the windowsill, watching me for a moment. "You look happy." "I am," I replied. "Not perfect, not untouched, but whole. For the first time in a long time." She nodded, sipping her coffee. "We heard back from the podcast producer. They loved our trailer." "You mean the one where I cried in the first 2 minutes?" "That's the one." She laughed. "They said it was raw and human." I chuckled. "Raw and human. That's going on my tombstone." Lila moved closer, her tone softening. "We also finalized the first round of grant approvals. 3 single mothers are getting full scholarships to finish college. One of them is a painter." Tears pricked at my eyes. "Jonathan would have loved that." She nodded. "He would have. He'd probably take credit for the idea too." I smiled and looked out the window. The trees in the park were turning, deep orange, honey gold, fire-red tips catching in the wind. The world was shifting seasons, just like we were. There was a knock at the studio door. I turned, half expecting one of my students, but it was Bryce. "Hey," he said, holding a manila folder under one arm and a tray with 3 muffins. "Brought breakfast. Pumpkin spice?" Lila asked, eyes lighting up. "Of course," he said. "I'm not a monster." He looked around the studio, taking it in. "This is a nice setup." "It's peaceful," I said. "Helps me think." He stepped inside and placed the folder on the table. "I finished reviewing the financials for Sterling Innovations. I think it's time we officially step back and let the new CEO run the show." I nodded. "It's the right move." We had hired a woman named Nadine from a tech nonprofit in Oregon. She was smart, no nonsense, and had already begun implementing ethical sourcing and equity sharing models Jonathan would have never considered. But she understood legacy, and she understood healing. "I also had lunch with Vanessa last week," Bryce added. Lila and I exchanged a look. "How did that go?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "Surprisingly civil. She's not doing well, but she's calmer. She still plans to live in the mansion, says she needs time before deciding if she wants to sell." "And the lawsuit?" Lila asked. He shook his head. "She's dropped it. Hartwell's team made it clear it would go nowhere. I think she's finally accepted it." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Good. That's something." "She asked if you'd be willing to meet," Bryce said. "Not now, later." I didn't answer immediately. The truth was, I didn't hate Vanessa. I pitied her. She had played a role, yes, but so much of it had been driven by fear, of losing what she'd built, of facing her own reflection. And in some small, quiet way, I had once been her. A woman trying too hard to hold on to something already broken. "Maybe," I said softly, "in time." Bryce nodded, then pulled something from his pocket. A photo, crinkled at the edges, clearly old. "Found this in one of Dad's boxes," he said. "Thought you might want it." I took it from him carefully. It was of the 4 of us, Jonathan, me, Bryce, and Lila, standing on a rocky cliff in Maine, the wind whipping through our hair. Lila was clinging to my waist. Bryce was laughing mid-sentence. Jonathan had his arm around me. We looked like a family. A real one. I felt something catch in my throat. "Thank you," I said. "We've got more boxes to go through," he said. "You should come over this weekend." "I'd like that." As they talked about logistics and schedules, I looked around the room, at the light bouncing off the walls, at the two grown children I thought I'd lost forever, at the art blooming quietly on every surface. This wasn't the life I'd imagined. 15 years ago, I had nothing but a rented apartment, a broken heart, and a hope I didn't dare speak out loud. Now I had more than I knew what to do with. Money, yes, but more importantly, peace, purpose, forgiveness. Before they left, Lila pulled me into a hug. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too," I said, holding her tight. Bryce followed with an awkward one-armed squeeze. "You did good, Mom," and that meant more than he could have ever known. As the door closed behind them, I turned back to my canvas. The blues had dried, but the gold still shimmered slightly, not yet set. I dipped my brush into the paint, added one more streak of light across the horizon. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was mine, and it was the beginning of something beautiful. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means something in Grace's journey. Her quiet strength, her patience, her unwavering love resonated with you. This wasn't just a story about money or inheritance. It was about something far deeper. The power of truth, the beauty of second chances, and how forgiveness can rebuild what seemed beyond repair. Grace didn't seek revenge. She chose understanding. And in doing so, she didn't just reclaim her children, she reclaimed her voice, her purpose, and her peace. Let this be a reminder to all of us. It's never too late to make things right. Whether it's with family, friends, or even ourselves, healing begins the moment we stop defending the past and start building the future. We'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel. We share true-to-life stories that inspire, heal, and bring people closer together. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Until next time, take care, and don't be afraid to forgive. You never know what it might return to you.